Well, this is actually a very simple presentation. I'm going to show you the results of an experiment. Okay, it's a single experiment. I'll tell you a very brief story and what happened. So maybe I should have listened to Jean-Baptiste before we designed this experiment, because you see our numbers here. So we manipulate the source of copper, manganese, and zinc in the diet of transition cows, okay, from 245 days of gestation to 105 days in lactation. So here's your typical sources of inorganic zinc, copper, and manganese that are supplemented in diet. So they're most likely to be sulfates. Hopefully you're not feeding any oxides to cattle, okay? And obviously, as any salt, hopefully somewhere in the GI tract, primarily after they go through the abomasum, they dissociate. But a lot of this dissociates in the rumen as well. And they release ionized zinc, ionized copper, and ionized manganese. Okay, and some of those have implications to what happens in the rumen. So here's an example of copper sulfate pentahydrated in solution. So if it were to be completely ionized, it would become a copper element, sulfate, plus water. And obviously, we all know we use copper sulfate to control microbes and bacteria. We do this in cattle as a foot bath. We do this in poultry by overfeeding copper to not use antimicrobial. And this ionic copper can kill bacteria, which means that it can also kill ruminal bacteria. Okay? And the same can be true for zinc in this example here. So ionic bonding is not very strong, doesn't share electrons, so they can more easily ionize. Okay, so ionized zinc can also be bactericidal. Okay, and there's been some suggestion that the increased concentrations of free ions in the rumen that have antibacterial effects and affect digestibility of products. For instance, fibrolytic bacteria would be sensitive to that, and this can reduce fiber digestion in the rumen, although you may have compensation downstream in the large intestine, but this obviously would have implications to nitrogen metabolism. Okay, so here's just an example of sulfate that has an ionic bond. Here are organic elements that in our particular experiment we didn't use. And here is covalent bonding that shares electrons and has to go through changes in the environment, such as a very low pH, to more easily ionize and release the free metal. Once you have free metal, it doesn't matter whatever source you had. They are transported across the epithelial cell the same way, and JB already showed you the transport of copper, the transport of zinc as an example, okay, across the intestinal epithelial cell. Okay, so in our particular experiment, we were comparing hydroxychloride sources with your typical sulfate source to supplement trace minerals. Okay, so they were both inorganic sources. So we use this here, or this here, or this here, compared to the hydrated sources of copper, zinc, and manganese in our diet. Okay. So typically, particularly the copper and the zinc, they tend to become very stable in your typical rumen pH. Seems like manganese tends to be less stable, although the measures that I've seen are not probably the most accurate. But they didn't necessarily measure ionize, they just measure solubility, which is an indication there's a potential for ionization. So here's an example of work from Colorado State University, in which they look at sulfate trace minerals or hydroxychloride trace minerals, should be HTM. Okay, and they look at the soluble zinc, the soluble copper, and the soluble manganese, okay, coming from the two sources. And you can see that the sulfate sources are a lot more soluble, particularly the zinc and the copper. Perhaps the manganese not as much different between the two sources. Okay, so one point here is that in the typical rumen pH of a cow of 5.8 to 6.5, these products here would be more stable compared to sulfates, it would release less of the free metal. But once they go through the abomasum and the proximal duodenum, when the pH is low, they would solubilize and you would have the free metal there, but you would interfere less with rumen metabolism. So obviously, at Kevin, anything that you measure in general, with the exception of free fatty acids and beta-hydroxybutyric acid, things tend to go down because of a combination of sequestering, if an animal has disease, of nutrients, extraction by the mammary gland, a little bit of extraction by the fetus, and obviously a reduction in intake that happens in the last 2 or 3 days before calving. So all of that results in reduced concentrations of nutrients in blood. In this example here, you have tocopherol, okay, vitamin A, and in this example, you see plasma zinc concentrations going down, maybe combination of movement to the tissues, reduction in intake, and sequestration because of the pro-inflammatory response of calving. So all of those things may affect blood levels. But you see already a reduction over time, perhaps related to uptake by tissues, but also reduction in intake that happens close to calving. So this would make the case that with the disease challenge around calving and the changes in blood concentration of nutrients, that's a target window for us to think about source elements. Okay, I'll show you one experiment only and then a meta-analysis just to make a point. So here's a study from you guys, correct? So I'm showing your data, in which they looked at two sources of trace minerals, the sulfate and the hydroxychloride that I'm interested on, but they also had a combination with a portion of that trace mineral coming from an organic source. I'm going to ignore the organic component, okay, because most of the response came from the source of either sulfate or hydrox trace mineral. And I want to focus on this here. You know, this is total tract apparent digestibility of NDFs, okay, which obviously has a component in the rumen, it has a component in the large intestine. So we're not looking at the rumen here, and that may not show the whole picture, but you can see that there were differences attributed to the source of trace mineral, in this particular case, the HTM, which is the combination of this here and this versus this and this. That's the contrast. So if you look at the combination of STM, it's 49.7, 48.9, and you can see that the values here are about 1.2, 1.5 percentage points greater in digestibility, okay? That's total tract. It's possible that in the rumen, that difference is a little larger than that. It's small, but you're getting a little bit more fiber digestibility, okay, which is telling you that's affecting the rumen. And then Barry Bradford at Michigan State pulled this data together, and what he found in the literature, and he looked at the effect of replacing sulfate sources with hydroxychloride on total tract nutrient digestibility. Not a lot of data. It's not a very robust data set, but that's what we have available today, okay? So they applied mixed models to look at the difference. They account for the things that you would expect. They look at the effect size or the difference between the treated and control, in this case, HTM minus STM, heterogeneity of the data, so on and so forth, and they came to the same conclusion. So they found 12 comparisons. So experiments that had a comparison between the same level of trace mineral, but two different sources. And the mean response was 1.5 percentage units, okay? So there's some indication that this concept of having free ions in the rumen may affect digestibility. So preventing the release of the free metal there might be beneficial to digestibility. Okay. Well, so this sort of set the point to the experiment that we've done. So we had multiple hypotheses because we look at typical experiment that we do. We look at multiple things. Was that replacing sulfate with hydroxychloride, we anticipate that would increase tissue concentration of trace minerals. Okay, so less interaction in the rumen with other compounds, and that would improve tissue retention of trace minerals, although I don't have those data to show you because we're just finishing the serum and the liver concentration of those trace minerals. So the objective, and by improving mineral supply during that transition period, would be beneficial to health of cows and other aspects. So our objectives were to evaluate the effects of these two sources, one sulfate, the other one hydroxychloride, as supplemental zinc, copper, and manganese on responses of cows during the postpartum period. So we enrolled 141 cows, so 70 and 71 cows in the experiment, and we planned for this level of supplemental zinc, copper, and manganese. So we want to add to the diets 30 milligrams per kilogram of zinc as supplemental zinc, 6 milligrams of copper as supplemental copper, and 20 milligrams per kilo of diet as supplemental manganese. Okay, so we analyze all our feed ingredients, and you will see what happens. So at the end, we expect that our diets would have these concentrations, and we fed the same level pre and postpartum. Okay, and we heard today that pre-partum you typically feed more just because intake's less, and you want to get a total mass of the metal being consumed by the cow. Okay. So our diets, we had a treatment with 70 cows and a treatment with 71 cows, and it was planned to have exactly the same. So we assign cows individually to treatments in this typical design. It's a randomized block design with individual feeding, and we had a pre-treatment diet and a post-treatment diet, and during the post-treatment diet was a single diet for the first 15 weeks after calving. The treatments were top dressed daily according to the amount of dry matter that we supplied. Okay. So this was a block design. We had 61 cows that would become first lactation, 80 cows that would become second or greater. Cows were assigned to their individual feeding gates at 240 days of gestation, and we trained them for 5 days, and then we start the experiment. So on average, they stayed in the treatment diets 28 days prepartum. No cow stayed fewer than 14 days, and they all stayed 105 days postpartum. So we blocked them by their genomic breeding values. They were all genotype cows for energy-corrected milk in the case of heifers. In the case of cows, we blocked them by the previously completed lactation, energy-correct milk. And then within block, we assigned them to treatment to minimize variability. Okay, so here's what we did to the cows. So they were fed the diets from 246 days of gestation all the way to 105 days. We have measurements pre-partum, your typical intake, body weight, body condition score, energy balance. Took blood samples multiple times pre-partum, and we look at the day relative to calving to analyze those samples for multiple analytes. And then we collect blood at calving, and then twice a week for the first 4 weeks after calving. We collect liver tissue at 10 and 50 days postpartum from all the cows, and we look at mineral content and mRNA transcripts for things related to mineral metabolism, gluconeogenesis, etc., although I don't have all the data to show you. And then we look at disease incidence in those cows. And then we look at reproduction and survival of the cows. Right here, about 50 days, we inseminate those cows and we flush conceptus. It's a pregnant embryo at about day 16. So we do a uterine flush to look at transcriptomic signals from the endometrium and from the conceptus tissue. I can just show you some more general information. So our case definitions, if a cow calved today, tomorrow she had placenta hanging, she had a case of retained placenta. We look at vaginal discharge score in the first 3 weeks of cows. If they had watery, brownish, fetid discharge in the first 3 weeks with foul smell, that would be called metritis. If she had fever concurrent with metritis, would be puerperal metritis. And then we do the same here about 4.5 weeks, looking for purulent discharge as an indication of clinical endometritis. We scanned those cows to see if they had ovulated, and we did cytology, endometrial cytology in every cow to see if they had inflammation in the endometrium about 6 weeks after calving. And then they are synchronized. Then in about 60-some days, we flush an embryo from them. As you can see, being done here, and then we resynchronize them for the farm, and they are bred, and they go into the reproductive management of the farm. Okay, and then we found those cows. So we're looking at Conceptus, an embryo of that's elongated. It's not more like a typical embryo that you would transfer on day 7 of gestation. Okay, so you can see an embryo coming there in this flush. So anyways, and then she goes into the reproductive program. So that's sort of we were looking at. So we look at production of colostrum from those cows and the composition of colostrum. We measure milk yield every day. We collect milk samples 4 times a week for concentration of fat, protein, lactose, solids not fat, urea, nitrogen, and fatty acids. And here's the colostrum yield. So you will see this is the nutrient content of what we supplement to the cows. And I want to make a few points here. You know, when you look at an experiment and people said, hey, this experiment is 15 ppms of copper, and they show in the table 15 ppms of copper. It's not like that. So to do this, we went to the feed mill every time they prepare our supplements that we add in the experiment. We flushed the entire system of the feed mill with calcium carbonate. And then they made our mixture with the precise equipment they have. And then we were there taking samples, maybe 20 to 30 samples, every batch of mineral mix they prepare for us. And we analyze all of that. And there's a lot of variability in mineral analysis. All ICP, let me just show you here. This is the mineral supplement we use to the diets, okay? That we use in the diets. So here is zinc, okay? Our top dress had 3,000 ppms of zinc, prepartum, 7,000 postpartum. Okay, look at the standard deviation here. It's very large. Say maybe our grab samples are 20 or 30 grab samples of each bag they fill for us was not perfect. Maybe the ICP analysis we did was not perfect, or maybe the equipment they have is not perfect. Something there. Okay, it's quite a bit of variability. And that's going to create variability in our treatments, okay? So when I showed you, our desirable 60 milligrams per kilo of diet, there's variability there. Some cows ate more, some cows ate less. And you can see the manganese and the copper. That's the supplement. Given what we fed in the supplement in our basal ingredients, here are our diets. This is the prepartum diet. The basal diet is exactly the same. So everything else is going to be equal. The variability is the change in composition of forage and perhaps change in composition of the grain ingredients. But look at the minerals. So we were close. Prepartum, we were pretty close. Okay? So about 66 milligrams of copper per kilo of diet. Zinc, 15 of copper. Manganese, 50 some. Postpartum, okay? We had a little more than we initially planned. We planned this to be exactly the same, but it was a little bit more than we actually initially planned, yeah? So now we have a lot more copper than we initially planned. And there's variability, okay, between the diets. And that's what we fed to the cows, not what we planned to feed, okay? So if you see an experiment that shows exactly what they planned, they probably never analyzed the data. That's probably what happened, okay? Okay, so here's our dry matter intake. We found no difference. You're going to see that in terms of intake of cows, we didn't find a difference. Okay, so cows were eating about 12 kilograms of dry matter pre-part. There's cows and heifers. Cows ate 3 kilograms more than heifers before calving, but no difference between treatments. Okay, and here's our body weight pre-partum. Our heifers calved at about 660 kilos. Our cows 770 kilos the week before calving. So when you put them together, this is the average you see. There's a little bit more intake in these animals here in the HTM, slightly heavier, but it's very small difference, just a few kilograms more than the STM. And the body condition score, they all follow what you would expect, a little difference in intake, but none of them were statistically different at the level of 5% probability. Okay, so here's the postpartum dry matter intake. So no difference between treatments. Our cows ate on average 22.8 kilograms in the experiment because we consider every day. But if you pick here, they were eating about 25, 26 kilograms at that stage. They lost weight, as you would expect, because of fetal weight and also weight postpartum. no difference in body weight change, and as expected, no difference in body condition score change. So in terms of what you can measure of energetics of the body, it looks like no differences there, and that's exactly what we found. So when you calculate net energy balance, because it's a function of intake of the cow primarily, well, because intake didn't differ, energy intake didn't differ, so they were in positive energy balance before calving. When they get to calving, it goes into negative energy balance. And I have to say energy balance is a very crude measurement. Most of the time it's probably wrong. But anyways, and they reach positive energy balance exact same time at about 8 weeks postpartum, regardless of treatment. Okay, so here's blood NIFA concentration, as you would expect, very low before calving. It peaks on the week of calving and then slowly comes down. But again, no difference between treatments, whether we analyze prepartum or postpartum. The prevalence of cows with blood ketones above 1.2 millimolar was quite low. We had not a lot of hyperketonemia. So about 5 to 10% of the cows had blood ketone about this threshold, whether you believe or not. But just so you have some sense for the data that we have and the health of the cows that we worked with. Okay, so here's colostrum yield. You're going to see results for one treatment and the other. You're going to see that partition into nulliparous and multiparous cows. There's 60 nulliparous cows, 30 and 30, and there's 81 multiparous cows, 40 and 41. Okay, so what we observed was increased colostrum yield, at least a tendency at the 8% probability. And because they produce a little bit more colostrum, as you can see in this treatment here, there's about 1.5 kilograms more. The yield of components went into that direction. Not that the composition of colostrum changed, but because the yield was a little more, we got more total solids. Okay, we got more megacalories secreted as colostrum energy by the cows that were fed HTM. We don't know very well why this happened, so it's all hypothetical at this point. The milk I'll show you, and I think we have a better idea. Okay, so here's the milk yield. We had a tendency for increase in milk yield in the cows that were fed the hydroxytrace minerals compared to the sulfate. And then when we adjust for fat and protein, so this energy-corrected milk would be a milk that contains about 0.7 megacalories per kilo. It's a milk standardized to 3.5% fat, 3.1% true protein, and 4.9% lactose. Now you can see that these cows produce 1.5 kilograms more. The average of these two versus this is 1.5 kilograms more in the treatment that received HTM. Some of that was because they secrete more fat and they secrete also more true protein. Therefore, the total solid secretion in milk in the first 15 weeks was greater. Okay, so because they secrete more fat, so the groups of fatty acids are also going to be influenced. Okay, so the yield of fatty acids increase, but you can see here now there is a treatment by parity interaction because the increment was primarily in the multiparous cows and not in the primiparous. So here's the ECM of all the cows. You can see where the differences start was about 3 weeks after, although we don't have a treatment by week interaction. Okay, and it stayed constant throughout the experiment. So when you look at fat yield is the same and the true protein yield is the same. Okay, so you get this 1.5 kilograms more. Okay, so here's the milk urea nitrogen. Our diets are exactly the same, so we saw no difference. It goes up just because cows are consuming more nitrogen, so that increases. Our somatic cell score goes down as you expect because this is colostrum influence. Some more inflammatory response there. Maybe a cow we had 2 cows with mastitis in the experiment. So that was not an issue. Now what we did is we calculate what the diet net energy for lactation should have been given the energy secreted in milk, the assumed maintenance of the cow, which is 100 kilocalories per kilogram of metabolic weight, and the daily change in body weight. So we weigh cows 3 times a day during the experiment, and we calculate the body weight change. And in the NRC, in the nascent, there is a formula there to adjust that for body composition based on energy balance. And in the first 3 weeks, we saw a calculated NEL to be greater for the HTM compared to the STM. Okay? So this is the calculated NEL based on the animal responses. You may say, how come your diet is the same and you now get more megacalories per kilogram of diet because of that? You will see that's probably because of disease incidence that's affecting the energetics of the cow. Okay, so here's the disease incidence in the cows. Retained fetal membrane, we had less in those animals. This is the odds ratio, the adjust odds ratio. If you want to see, we had one cow with hypocalcemia in each treatment, one multiparous. You can see mastitis, we had one case here, we had 0 cases here. So when you look at the overall, I'll go down here, I'll just skip this and go to the overall response, which is morbidity. In the first 105 days, we had less morbidity in the cows that were fed HTM than the STM, and we attribute primarily that as being the reason for that increase in milk that results in the calculated net energy for lactation to be better. And the morbidity difference was attributed primarily to uterine disease, a little bit less retained placenta, numerically less, but not statistically, metritis. But then if you look at clinical endometritis at 32 days postpartum and subclinical endometritis to be less. So somehow these trace minerals are affecting the ability of cow to fend for herself in early lactation. Okay, so here is the survival curves for the rate of morbidity. Most cows get sick in the very first weeks of lactation, no surprise. You can see the rate of morbidity is faster here, but the lines separate. So every cow here is supposedly to be healthy, and they were healthy. And as they calve, they develop disease, but the rate of disease is less. You can see it's 42% less in the blue line than in the red line. The blue line is the HTM compared to the STM. It's just my time here that I need to stop. So this is the survival of the cows for the 300 days postpartum. You can see that in the HTM, the farm eliminate about 12% of the cows, whereas in the HTM, they eliminate about 12% of the cows, and in the STM, they eliminate about maybe 22 or 24% of the cows. So 75% of them, or 78, remain in the herd by 300 days. So we had reduced culling. Part of the reduced culling in those cows, in the blue line compared to the red line, was because we had a little bit less disease, they produced more milk, and they became pregnant faster. So here's the proportion of cyclic cows by 30 days postpartum. They had ovulated, no difference. So if you come across here, there were no differences in a lot of the reproductive measures that I have to show you here. So you look at day 16 pregnancy when we flush a conceptus, okay, numerically favoring the HTM, but no statistical effect. The concentration of this protein in the flush fluid, this protein that blocks luteolysis called interferon tau is secreted by the trophoblast cells of the conceptus, the placental cells, and that maintains the corpus luteum active. A little bit more, but no effect. So we were unable to detect differences in some of these key responses. Okay, progesterone concentrations after AI were the same, so no indication of changes in luteal secretion of progesterone. On day 19, we had exactly the same progesterone concentration in those cows, and then we collect vaginal fluid or cervical fluid to measure interferon-stimulated genes. I won't have time to show you. Okay, so here is the proportion of pregnancy per AI, numerically favoring this group. But if you look at over the lactation, how many cows became pregnant by the 305 days, then we detect a difference here. And the reason for that is because the rate of pregnancy was faster for the blue compared to the red. So over time, the pregnancies accumulate, and you can see that the rate of pregnancy was 23% greater for the HTM compared to the STM. The blue line drops faster than the red line, and that results in more pregnant cows at the end of the lactation. Okay, just to summarizing, replacing sulfate source of zinc, copper, and manganese with the hydroxychloride tend to increase colostrum yield, although it didn't change composition, so the yield of components of colostrum increased. But it did increase energy-correct milk in the first 15 weeks of lactation. Okay? When we calculate the energy of the diet, which accounts for changes in body weight, which I attribute primarily to disease, the big changes, the diet provide, I'm not saying that minerals have energy, please don't interpret it as that, yeah? This is the calculate energy supply based on our assumptions. The diet provide another 3.5% more energy than the STM because of the disease impact. But maybe there's some effect on digestibility and site of digestion. Maybe that story of the NDF is also important here. I just cannot account for that. Okay, replacing sulfate reduce the risk of uterine disease in early lactation, and that result in less morbidity. Cows survive more by 300 days postpartum, primarily because less disease and improved reproduction. So we did not see an effect on the proportion of pregnant cows on day 16 or measures of conceptus development, although we have a lot of data. I just don't have time to show you. But we did see benefits to health and some improvements in reproduction, which combined provide some advantages to the HTM compared to the STM. So I just want to thank everybody who helped in this particular experiment. It's a lot of work to do all of this. We get no help from our farm, and these guys work 12 hours a day for 12 months, 7 days a week to do this experiment. So, and obviously I want to thank Celco and the team in the USA for supporting this project. Thank you very much.
Interesting experiment and such interesting results, of course. One question, leaving the rest for the panel. Anyone?
Jose, what's the mechanism for the increased colostrum yield with the hydroxy?
You had to ask me the one that I don't know or don't have any idea. So, you know, we diagnose clinical disease, yeah? We don't know if those things, like such a retained placenta, it's happening before calving. Yeah? So if you look at how, I'll pick retained placenta as an example. So when cows become pregnant, they have to suppress mechanisms of uterine defense against what we call alloantigens. So you get DNA from the father and the mother, the bull and the cow. The cow has no idea the antigens that are contributed from the paternal side. Yeah? So think about a woman who gets pregnant. So she has to down-regulate mechanisms of recognition of what this so-called alloantigen. So she suppresses that. When she gets closer to calving, those mechanisms go up. She upregulates mechanisms of identifying foreign antigens, which include the fetal component of the placenta, okay? For that to happen, an immune response is mounted against the placental tissue component of the calf. And during this process, immune cells migrate and they have to destroy the protein connections between them. And trace minerals play a role in the survival of immune cells because, for example, copper works through superoxidized dismutase to prevent the killing of the cells during this phagocytic oxidative burst process. So it's possible that things that are happening before calving are also affecting the mammary gland in terms of proliferation of cells, the same way it affects the uterus and that. But do I have a good idea? No, I don't. So I don't know why colostrum was more. But in reflecting milk, my simplistic view is that the milk response is a combination of maybe more rumen digestion of fiber and components and the health. But we didn't have sick cows before calving to affect colostrum, but there may be other mechanisms that we have no idea. Maybe you guys have.
More research is needed. It's always the right answer for...
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, our understanding of colostrum yield in cows is almost negative. We don't even know how components are transferred to the mammary epithelial cell in the cow. It's all extrapolated from other species. So, anyways, so thank you very much.